One of the most important things that we need to do in order to heal from trauma is to be able to really attune to ourselves so that we know when our system is starting to go into a state of distress. And we also want to be able to expand our capacity to be with and hold stress or distress in our system so that we aren't so quick to tip over into activation. So today we're going to explore that and talk a little bit about how we can expand our capacity. So if you've been following the series, we've been talking a little bit about this idea of your freezing point, which is this moment when you hit a state of relaxation, but because your system is not used to that, it's more used to chaos and dysregulation, that being in a relaxed state can actually cause you to start stressing. And we talked about in the last video, the idea of stress laxing, right? And so your system can become activated. And maybe you've been doing some work to begin identifying like I can get to this state of relaxation and I'm present and I'm grounded. And ooh, if I go a little bit deeper, then that is a place where I start to actually feel discomfort. Not everybody has a freezing point, so you may not be working with that. The other thing that we've been talking about is the idea of a boiling point. So this is when there is more distress, there's something happening in your environment, in a circumstance, and you may have different degrees of distress. So mild and moderate, all the way up to like extreme distress. And depending on your capacity, you may hit mild distress and check out, become dissociated. That might be too much for your system. And so when you think about the distance between kind of let's just kind of look at this for a moment. Okay, so if we have the idea of like our freezing point, okay, and then our idea of our boiling point. So whatever the space and distance is between that, this is a state that we can think of as like your degrees of freedom. So again, we're drawing on and pulling from our trauma toolkit book. Here it is, handy dandy. We love it. Very helpful. Okay, so on the thermometer, like maybe what's really so is that you can only like get down to a certain level of relaxation. Like maybe you mark that at like 10. And if you go to any state of relaxation below that, you start becoming activated. So this is like activation can sit down here. Okay. And then again, this can be like your freezing point. Okay. And then activation can also happen up here. And this is the idea of your boiling point. Okay. And so then that space, let's just say this is at like 40 or something like that. Okay. So then the idea is that this space energetically between your freezing point and your boiling point is where your system can remain grounded in regulation. There's no activation, there's no distress. And if you start to go above that boiling point, you're going to have trouble. If you start to go below that freezing point, you're going to have some trouble. And again, you might not have a freezing point. Okay. And so what's really so is that when my clients come to me, they have various degrees of freedom. So, somebody might actually have a lot of room, a lot of space. Okay. So, but let's just imagine that you're starting out with this, 1040. Now we want to eventually, if we think about like, okay, here's the capacity. We're going to think about this as like your capacity for grounding, for system regulation, for just being chill and living your life. Okay. All right. Now, if it's a small window, then that means like this is the experience that so many of my clients talk about, which by the way, I certainly lived. Like you go out into the world and it's like everything just like ping, I'm activated, ping, I'm activated. There's another moment. There's another moment. It's almost like you're like this live wire because your capacity is very small window. And then that window can get even smaller if you're experiencing a life crisis, if you're not eating well, if you're not sleeping well. Okay, so there are other things that can change your degrees of freedom, even if you have a lot of capacity. And so again, our goal is to create more and more space, right? We want to see an expansion of this capacity. Yeah. We want to build it out so that we can go out into the world, so that we can stay more and more present. I love this concept, this idea of degrees of freedom, freedom to live my life, freedom to be present, freedom to just go out and do what I need to do in a day and not be like coping and strategizing and dealing with activation and dissociation. I am just free and living my life. And I've experienced this in my own journey, like noticing my capacity growing and growing and growing. And I want to reiterate that even if you get to a place where you have a high capacity, if something comes into your world that knocks you off, like your capacity can change. So again, if you're not sleeping well, if you're not eating, if you're dealing with like a death or a breakup, or you lose your job, or maybe you're all of a sudden taking on a lot of things, like you're going to school and you're doing the family and there's this thing out, and you're working, you add something in, that can also impact how much capacity your system has for managing the distress. Okay, beautiful. So now, of course, the question is, how do we increase our capacity? All right. So there are lots of ways to do this, but we've talked a little bit about this idea of actually going into states of distress, letting the system feel that, be with that in an intentional and in a supported way, and then moving back out of that. It's like a muscle that you're building, right? So if you're like lifting weights, like the first time you lift, a 20-pound weight, you might be like, oh my gosh, that's really hard, but then if you've been doing it a while, it's like, oh, that muscle's getting stronger. Yep, I can be with that feeling. Yep, I can be with that and stay with that and not go into dysregulation. So in some ways, it's a little bit like exposure therapy or activation. And so the idea is like really learning how to work with your distressing thoughts, your distressing feelings, and emotions and sensations in a way that you can manage them, remain with them, and not run away from them by either freezing or just, going into fight or flight. Okay. So what's really important here then is that you start to attune to yourself. It's like these little temperature checks during the day, and like just noticing, like, where am I? Well, in my degrees of freedom, like am I in that state? Am I somewhere in the middle? Am I starting to approach my boiling point, in which case I need to back off? This is in your day-to-day life, but particularly when you're doing trauma healing work. Okay. So if you're starting to, notice that you're approaching the boiling point, then you need to stop. You just need to stop. You need to pause. You need to take a step back. If there's a technique or a strategy that you're trying to use to work in through the trauma, and that's moving you more towards your boiling point than towards regulation, then you need to switch it up. You need to change that out. And soon, we're going to be starting to talk about some specific, self-regulation, nervous system regulation tools. And of course, these are things that I teach in my program all the time. So we'll get into some of the specific strategies and techniques, but right now, just being attuned and noticing, right? And if disengaging just means like let me go for a walk, let me do some breathing, let me get on the floor and do some stretching. Let me turn my attention to something completely else, like read a book or watch a funny movie, right? These sorts of things. But that self-awareness piece of knowing, oh, I'm starting to approach that boiling point, or I'm starting to approach that freezing point. And before you get there, being able to articulate that, being able to name it, being able to then shift gears, slow down, back off. And healing the nervous system, again, takes time, but it's through a variety of practices that you can really grow and expand your capacity. So again, you have more and more access to freedom and being chill in your life and just walking through your day without feeling like you're on pins and needles or every little thing is about, to tip you over into activation. Okay. So I think that's what I want to say about that today. And as always, if you have questions as you're working with this, let me know, check in. But the invitation here is to really start noticing, like, what is my actual capacity? Can I start to notice where I am in my degrees of freedom? And when I'm starting to approach either a boiling point or a freezing point, can I pause and can I slow things down so that I don't tip over into activation? And then again, maybe doing some intentional work to go into places that feel a little stressy, so that you can feel the distress in your system and then pull out of it, like lift that weight, build that muscle. Okay. So always take things slow, be kind to yourself, give yourself a lot of grace and compassion as you're doing this work. And if I can be a support to you, I'm here. Okay. Until next time, take good care of you.